Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I am Willi Zwozdesky. I'm the Executive Director of the British Columbia Choral Federation, and I'm happy to welcome you here this evening, this very happy Friday evening. On behalf of the British Columbia Choral Federation, I wish to acknowledge with gratitude that we work, live, and sing on the unceded territories in this region of more than 200 First Nations, whose rich artistry, culture, and traditions surround us. With that said, I would like to welcome all of you to this all-access webinar. I view this as a continuation of the work that we started, if you could believe it, in May. The workshop on safe singing was May 21st of 2020. So we've been at this for almost a year, consistently bringing updates and new messages. The choral community, as we all know, has been in a very unfortunate and sort of unique position this past year. We've had some challenges getting to the top of the ladder with getting information from the health professionals and from, the BC Center for Disease Control about choral singing and about group singing. I do want to say, though, that we have ultimately sort of climbed to the top, and we have been getting some consistent information. This evening, thanks to the inspiration of Dr. Carolyn Shiau, we have a choral specific presentation, though, an update on choral community and immunity specifically. So let me just introduce our presenters briefly before I hand over to them. Dr. Carolyn Shiau is a laboratory physician at Royal Columbian Hospital, as well as being a pianist, singer, arranger, and video editor. She sings in Phoenix Chamber Choir, and we were just talking about their upcoming show, which is very exciting. She has recently taken on a role as a physician lead for the COVID-19 vaccine clinics in Fraser Health, and we all know about Fraser Health, and has been working to facilitate the vaccine rollout as both an immunizer and an organizer. Also on the Zoom this evening, we have Vaughn Chauvin, who is a pharmacist who splits his time between his community pharmacy and his role as a clinical associate professor in the UBC Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences. He also sings with Phoenix Chamber Choir, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's some connection between the two of them as a result of that. Or maybe they showed up before then. I don't know. You could ask them. He has recently been lucky enough to help the COVID-19 vaccine effort as an immunizer in both hospital-based clinics and long-term care facilities. So with that said, I would like to turn the microphone over to our presenters. Welcome, Carolyn and Vaughn.
So thank you, Willi, for the kind introduction, and to the BC Choral Federation for providing a platform in which to address some of the issues around COVID-19 and vaccination and how it relates to us as a choral community. I believe this started because I noticed some posts on Facebook from my friends in the choral community asking and questioning some of the changing information that we were getting on vaccination. And I thought, my physician group has been encouraging all of us to reach out to our local communities and speak about vaccination and the importance of vaccination and what it means for us moving forward. And I thought, well, I have a community, it's my singing community. And I thought this is the community that we should reach out to. And for those who are wondering, we are in one bubble, we are married. And so this is still okay. And
we're pretty sure that meets guidelines.
We're pretty sure that meets guidelines. And we did meet in a choir before moving to BC. And when we came to BC, we looked to BC Choral Federation to find a choir to sing in, and we are happy to have found a home with Phoenix Chamber Choir.
Great.
So we're going to review today some of the questions that people have posted as they registered for this webinar. And we will try to leave enough time at the end. If questions come up during the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat, and then we will try to get to everybody's questions. Hopefully we'll address some of them as we go through the discussion. But the questions that came up sort of all filtered around similar themes. We wanted to address first the roots of virus transmission, because I think this is a topic that has been revisited many times, and we have a little more evidence now for how the virus transmits. We wanted to talk about the efficacy and safety of the COVID-19 vaccines that we currently have in BC and what it means for us. And we wanted to talk about the most common and pressing question on everybody's mind. What does this mean for us? When will we sing together again? And where am I going to find reliable information? And what should I reasonably expect to do? And while we don't have a crystal ball, we certainly have some evidence from other countries who are a little bit further ahead of us on what we may be able to accomplish as we move forward.
Yeah, and obviously we don't have any authority to give anybody permission to do anything. That's not our roles. But it's we have, as healthcare professionals, found it hard to figure out where to get the right information because there's so much available and it's changing so quickly. So we thought that we might share a little bit of where the best places are to look and kind of what to expect to see from that kind of information from the government. Now, we're both educators. We're both stuck on Zoom far more than we want to be, and we both have developed far more fluency in Zoom than we ever wanted to have. That being said, we have tried really hard with our students to make our sessions a little bit more interactive. So we're going to go ahead and make it interactive. So we're going to start with a couple of little polls, and there'll be a few polls throughout. These are entirely anonymous. The 50-question multiple choice exam at the end of the session is not anonymous. We will, no, I'm just kidding. So we wanted to ask a couple of questions. So they're anonymous. You can go ahead and answer. First of all, just out of our own curiosity, the first question is, have you had your vaccine yet?
Wow, that is impressive.
That is pretty good. And obviously we're talking about first dose at this point, which we'll get into a little bit, but so we'll end the poll and share the results, and you can see it's pretty much 50-50, you know, kind of US election level 50-50. So that's much higher than the
that's much higher than I was expecting. That's almost herd immunity for the choral community.
Almost, well, for people on this webinar.
On this call.
Yeah.
So this choir can get together, this webinar choir.
Okay, so that's the first one. And then, well, it won't let me click, hold on. This always does this to me. 1 second. All right. And then the next question is, for those of you who weren't vaccinated or those who are vaccinated, you can answer too. If you were offered a co-vaccine appointment today, would you get it? Yes, no, not sure, and depends on which vaccine. So how many? We got 71. All right, looks like we've got pretty much everybody. So if we share the results, there's a lot of yes, and a little bit of not sure, and a little bit of depends which vaccine, which is exactly what we would expect. Great.
So let's start again by revisiting this question about, is it aerosols or is it droplets? And so this question continues to come up, and I think the reason it comes up is because at the very beginning, we were very hypervigilant about where we could find this virus. And the technique that we use for detecting virus is very, very sensitive, which means I can find itty bitty little bits of particles of virus on just about anything. So now that we've watched as this virus spreads, the predominant route of spread is still through droplets. So can you find it in an aerosol, and can you find it on a surface? The answer is yes, you definitely can. Is that enough to make you sick if you were to lick the surface or if you were to touch the surface? It's possible, but it's a very low risk. And so even our medical health officers are now advocating that you stop washing your groceries entirely when you get them home, that it's not that kind of level of transmission. We are still seeing it predominantly through droplets. Now, that said, the amount of droplets that get on things is significantly reduced by wearing a mask. And so that is why the encouragement to continue to wear masks and to continue to wash your hands constantly remains. But for the predominantly, COVID-19 spreads through droplets, and that's why we still maintain the 2-meter distance. and why we're still encouraging mask use, and why we're still encouraging hand washing. And so that's why that public health guidance is stated. So yes, even though you can detect virus in small amounts in various places, whether or not that amount of virus is enough to actually make you sick, actually make you test positive, is a totally different story. So we're finding that is less likely, not impossible, but less likely.
And if you're wondering how we know that as a scientific community, it has to do with the models that describe how different types of diseases spread depending on their type of transmission. So yes, even though you may find it on tables, you may find it, in aerosols, it's not moving the same way we would expect a truly aerosolized virus to move. So yes, you can find it in aerosols, but we don't see the actual outcome of it being an aerosolized disease. So, it's one of those things where, yes, you can find it, but logically we have to say it doesn't really transmit through aerosols. Another big thing to address is what is the purpose of a vaccine. So there's 4 things here: prevent death, prevent severe morbidity, prevent mild to moderate morbidity, and prevent transmission. Most people think it does all 4, and that the goal and purpose of a vaccine is to do all 4. Well, obviously we'd love it if vaccines would do all 4. The reality is that vaccines are primarily designed to handle 1 and 2. To prevent death and to prevent severe morbidity. It's not a bulletproof shield that once you have the vaccine, you just can't get the disease. It just means that your body will handle it in a much different way. So that's actually a very important difference to understand, that even after you've had the vaccine, it is still possible to get COVID. It's just very, very unlikely, as we'll see later, for you to actually die from it or end up in the hospital from it. So a little bit about what vaccine efficacy means, because these numbers get thrown around all the time, and it's a little bit challenging to try and figure out what those numbers mean. So for example, if a vaccine says that it's 80% effective, what does that mean? There's a really great video that you should watch at the end of this session if you have time on YouTube. If you just look for why you can't compare COVID-19 vaccines from Vox, and I'll show you a couple of screenshots in a minute so you'll recognize it when you see it. But it talks a little bit about how the efficacy numbers for vaccines are created, and it's a very, very good video. But the percentage of efficacy tells you that if you're vaccinated, how likely it is that you're going to test negative for COVID if you are exposed. This is determined during clinical trials, where they take a whole bunch of people and give some of them vaccine and some of them placebo, and then count how much COVID happens on either side. It's not always a reflection of real world situations, but it's definitely impacted by real world situations. And Pfizer and Moderna trials were conducted in the US during the summer months, where there was very little COVID-19 comparatively, and before the variants of concern were the dominant strain. So this is something that you see all the time, that everyone says, which vaccine is better for this variant? Let me show you a little bit about that. So these are some screenshots from that Vox video, and the link is down there. But it's easier to Google it rather than try and write that down, because it's a lot of weird letters. But you can see here that these are the clinical trial times. Oh, thank you for putting that link up. These are the clinical trial period. So you can see these are COVID rates on the graph, and you can see Moderna and Pfizer are these kind of green ones, and Johnson & Johnson was done during the height of COVID. So as I said, it's not a vaccine efficacy is not a very good it's not a fantastic representation. It's not a fantastic representation of the real world, but at the same time, it is affected by the real world. So you can also see here on the bottom one that you see the different variants and when they were identified. And you can see, if you compare those spikes and those dates, that most of the clinical data for the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines were done largely prior to the first variants kind of showing up. But this is another slide that basically shows the efficacy against death and hospitalization is almost 100% for every single vaccine. So no matter which vaccine you get, the chances of you ending up in the hospital or having or ending up dying from the COVID infection are almost zero. if you've had a vaccine, which it's not perfectly 100%, but it's really amazingly close, which is not something that we're used to seeing in vaccines, to be honest. So these are all very effective vaccines, all of them.
So we wanted to talk a little bit, some people had asked about the vaccine supply that's coming to BC. And so this is actually very public knowledge. You can find this on Health Canada's website, but as of today, this is the number of doses that have been delivered to BC. And so keeping in mind that BC has a population of close to 5 million, of which at least just under 4 million would be the adults who are eligible for vaccine. This is how much we've had delivered. So we've received somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.7 million doses, and we've administered about 1.3 million. And there is always a little bit of a lag and a gap there. And some of that is the AstraZeneca vaccine, which has not moved quite as quickly, and various different delays. We have to have enough vaccine on hand so that should we, have a delay in a Moderna shipment or something like that, we have enough vaccine to cover the clinics for the coming days. There is Health Canada approval for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. That is the 1 dose. All the other vaccines that we have are a 2-dose vaccine. Unfortunately, there is no supply of Johnson & Johnson vaccine at the moment in Canada, which is a little bit frustrating because we would like to get started on being able to offer a single-dose vaccine to as many people as possible. So when we think about all the vaccines, they are all excellent, but they are not perfect at preventing death and hospitalization for COVID-19. They certainly do a good job. Certainly, if you have underlying health conditions and you get COVID and it makes your underlying health condition worse, you may end up in the hospital. We would still count that as a hospitalization secondary to COVID, even though you might go in because your heart attack got worse or because your kidney disease became worse during that time. So that is still counted in our number of hospitalizations that are spurred on by COVID-19. All of the COVID-19 vaccines show some protection against the variants of concern. And the challenge is always that when we talk about like the success of a vaccine, the public thinks about like its success in reducing even mild to moderate illness. But really what we are concerned about again is death and hospitalization secondary to a variant of concern. Over 50% of the virus in the positive cases in BC are now variants. And so it's just going to become the new version of COVID-19 that we're dealing with. So the vaccines, they're not perfect, but again, they are better than having some protection is better than no protection. And so we are still encouraging people to think of it that way. But because it's not perfect, all vaccinated clients get the same advice in the clinic. You must continue your public health safety measures. That's the hand washing, the physical distancing, the isolating if you're symptomatic, and getting tested if you're symptomatic. All of those things stay in place. The vaccine doesn't change that, at least while we still have only about approximately 20% of the population vaccinated. I noticed that Bridget has a question here in the chat, and she's asked, are they considering mixing vaccines or giving 2 different shots? And the answer is currently in BC, the answer is no. If you get a vaccine, if you've been fortunate to be one of our people who've already had a dose of Pfizer or a dose of Moderna, we essentially are holding onto a 2nd dose of the matching vaccine for you. So everything is done in pairs so that everything is allocated for the matching dose at the 16-week mark.
There are some studies looking at particularly whether or not somebody who had Pfizer could get Moderna as the 2nd shot, or they could, if they got Moderna, get Pfizer as the 2nd shot. And that's mainly being done for a logistics perspective, because if we didn't have to worry about making sure your appointment was at a clinic that had the vaccine that you need that day for your 2nd shot, it would be much easier. And the vaccines are so similar that they're looking at that, but we don't have any evidence for that yet. Yeah, so we did have another question. So I'm going to launch the poll, and the questions are, what do you feel the biggest concerns are about the new vaccines? There's blood clots, pregnancy risk, fertility issues. The vaccines were rushed. Dosing intervals been extended. Let's see if we can see the total here. I think we've got most people there, so we'll share the results. So yeah, it looks like blood clots are a big thing, but the dosing interval being extended is a really big concern for people too. And we'll be kind of addressing each of these going through. So it was just nice for us to know which things were the most bothersome. Okay. Sorry, this thing keeps popping back. Okay.
So vaccine safety is something that we all take very seriously. And I think that is why you're starting to see a lot of the news media around it, and also why we would pause vaccines, because I think that this is a challenge when we're rolling out something new, especially on a very large scale. So I thought it would be important to note that every province across Canada has a AEFI system, or an AFI system, we refer to it as the AFI system. The AFI system basically follows any adverse event after any vaccine, not just the COVID vaccine, but any vaccine. And when you go to your vaccination, for those, oh, we're changing the lights. Okay, so when you go to your immunization appointment, you get one of these fancy cards that states, it doesn't always look like this, it states when you got your vaccine and which vaccine you got. And on the back of the card are the phone numbers for what if I had a bad side effect? What if I'm not sure I'm having a bad side effect? So on the back of your vaccination card should be the numbers to call in case you have an issue or you're not sure. And everybody is required to, if let's say you showed up in Emerge and you had an issue and you had your vaccine in the last 14 days, your emergency room physician is also required to report to the AEFI system. So that is a standard reporting system. We use that for tracking bad results or adverse events from specifically vaccines. So if you have any concerns or you had your vaccine and you're wondering if something might be related to your vaccine, it's still best to give that a phone call, and you can find their information on the BC CDC website. Okay. There weren't too many people actually asking about pregnancy, but this is one of the questions I'm starting to see a little bit more of as we get younger and younger people into the clinic. So I thought I would just at least point out that in the US, who is far ahead of us on their vaccine campaign, as of April 12th, over 86,000 women in the US have reported being pregnant and getting the vaccine, and over 4,400 have agreed to be followed closely through their pregnancy. And so the US has a similar system like the AFI system. They call it VSafe. Sort of makes more sense. They call it VSafe, and they track each woman through the different trimesters of their pregnancy, including after delivery and checking in with the infant when they are 3 months old. We are collecting similar information for BC through BC Children's and Women's Hospital. However, our numbers are much smaller, and we got started later on our vaccine campaign. So for looking at safety, at least we've got large numbers coming out of the United States.
It's important to mention here too with this is that especially the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines are very similar to previous vaccines that have existed in the past. It's the mRNA vaccines which are newer types of vaccine. But you have to remember that in the human body, vaccines basically work by presenting something to the immune system that the immune system then responds and builds a defense against. So the mRNA vaccines are a little bit different in how they actually present to the immune system, but the entire process from that step forward, which is the only part of it that's really systemic, like through the whole body, as opposed to just happening right in the muscles where the injection occurs, are very, they're very, very similar to every other inactivated vaccine we've ever had. And we've never really seen problems in pregnancy or with fertility for an inactivated vaccine.
So just so that everybody has seen it, the actual initial data, which was actually collected at the start of March with the initial cohort of 1,800 women, they published the outcomes with miscarriage and low birth weight and preterm birth and preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, all of the complications we think about typical for pregnancy, and compared the vaccinated population to an equivalent background population that was non-vaccinated. And the percentages and numbers look very identical, if not better, in the vaccinated population, which I think is very promising and is the first actual data that we've got regarding the mRNA vaccines in pregnancy, which I think is very positive and has been very reassuring for a number of our young healthcare workers who are concerned about pregnancy. So then the next question becomes, is it going to sterilize me? Like, am I not going to be able to get pregnant? Or if I've got concerns around my fertility, does that mean I shouldn't get vaccinated? This is a much harder question to answer, and fertility issues are a challenging issue no matter the circumstance, even aside, like COVID aside. So the US CDC is collecting data on this right now, asking women who are getting vaccinated, are they trying to get pregnant at the time? And there is, unfortunately, at this time, no official published data. However, I would note that actually Ontario, as of yesterday, put out a call to say any woman 20 weeks or gestational age 20 weeks or higher, they want them bumped to the top of the line for vaccine, because we are starting to see a lot more pregnant patients being admitted to our ICUs. Because during pregnancy, pregnant patients are at high risk for COVID-19 hospitalization and ICU stays. And any high fever during pregnancy, even if it was just the regular cold or regular flu, is dangerous for baby. So the lines that my obstetrician teacher taught me during medical school still stands. What's good for mom is good for baby. If chocolate ice cream is good for mom, chocolate ice cream is good for baby. And if foot rubs are good for mom, foot rubs are good for baby too. So what's good for mom is always good for baby, and that we're going to stick with that guidance. And it hasn't done anything, hasn't steered us wrong so far.
So obviously the big thing that people are concerned about right now, especially because it's impossible to read any newspaper without seeing at least 2 or 3 articles that are talking about this, is the idea of clotting with the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines. So what this is actually a risk of something that is now being called the vaccine-induced pro-thrombotic thrombocytopenia, which is a bit of a mouthful, but VIPIT is a lot easier to say. So VIPIT is a situation where a clot is occurring in a very abnormal place. So somewhere where blood is pooling a little bit and there's a clot forming. And it's not a typical clot either, which is something that a lot of people don't understand. So the risk of VIPIT is about 1 in 250,000 people vaccinated with AstraZeneca Covishield. And those are both AstraZeneca products. It just depends on where it was actually produced, which facility it was produced in. And it occurs 4 to 20 days post-vaccination. The symptoms are persistent headache, some neurological symptoms, easy bruising, and or swelling. And blood tests will actually determine if platelets are low, which is a very interesting part of VIPIT, is that it's actually a low platelets. All hospital physicians have received briefings and management on this condition. Every emerge is aware of it and keeping an eye out and screening for it. So it's rare, but incredibly well known, just not seen very often at all. The mechanism, as I said, is very different than what we normally think about when we think about a blood clot, and we won't go into a ton of detail, but just because if you've had an increased risk of clot in the past, there is no increased risk of this particular clotting situation or these clots occurring. And an individual VIPIT case is not altered by the use of aspirin or ASA, meaning that, so I've heard a lot of stories of people who get the AstraZeneca and then want to take 14 days of aspirin just to prevent a clot. As I said in the slide before, low platelets is something that is associated with this, and aspirin works as a blood thinner by being an antiplatelet medication. So it actually, that's how it affects clots, is with your platelets. We don't need to go into detail about that, but what I'm saying is that it works in the opposite direction of kind of what we want. It's not recommended. The rationale of current limitation for the AstraZeneca usage in the 55 to 65-year-old population is that these rare cases of VIPIT were noted in those who were younger than 55 and primarily female. I've put a quote here on the bottom. So this is from Thrombosis Canada. So Thrombosis Canada is an organization that helps create guidelines for healthcare professionals about how to deal with clotting disorders and how to deal with clotting issues. And they provide all the the guidelines that we use for therapy. And they put out a statement very recently that they continue to strongly recommend that all eligible adults receive the AstraZeneca vaccine, including people with a prior blood clot. I've edited it for brevity here, but it then goes on to describe a whole bunch of hereditary conditions and other clotting conditions and says all of those are fine. You can still have the AstraZeneca vaccine. And so we are aware of some of the questions that are in the chat here. So we'll look at a couple of these.
So then we have a question saying, what about those who received a first dose of AstraZeneca who are under the age of 55 before the pause due to the blood clot issue? Do we know if those people will be receiving a second dose of the same vaccine? And at this time, the current guidance in BC is we are not sure yet. We are waiting for the National Association of Canada, NACI, sorry, to make their final recommendation. So this is still pending, but we expect to see guidance from NACI within the next week, actually. So hopefully we'll have clarity on that question. But if you did not have this unusual antibody storm, which is the source of this VIPIT, if you did not have it secondary to the first dose of AstraZeneca vaccine, you are highly unlikely to have it to the second dose of AstraZeneca vaccine. It's one of these things where either your immune system was going to do this or it's not. And so the second booster dose should not, in theory, cause any other clotting issues. So if you made it through your first dose with no clotting issues after your 20 days, you're probably in the clear, and you
means you're in the 249,999 people that aren't going to get it. Most likely. And already we're talking really small numbers, but it's a really good question and something that we hear all the time is like, so if I'm now out of that age range, do I need to start a new vaccine series? We're waiting for official guidance, but nobody's talking about that.
Yeah, right now we have some guidance from Health Canada, which is the body that does the regulation of medications and approval of the drugs. And now we're waiting for their parallel side group to say whether or not they would recommend it for immunization. But basically, Health Canada has come out to say we are recommending it to any adult, regardless of the age. They're waiting for NACI to come up with their final guidance as well. So we usually do this two-prong approach. That's a pretty typical approach for most countries, to have a regulatory authority and then a body that reviews evidence independent of that regulatory authority to say we recommend this or we don't recommend this. So we're waiting for the second group to make their recommendation. That hopefully will come out within the next week. Okay, so there's a question about, has this clotting been potentially fatal? The answer is yes, but all clotting is potentially fatal. Every stroke is potentially fatal. Every heart attack is potentially fatal. All of those things are clot related. And so yes, there is that potential. It is a proportion of the people who got VIPIT. So we have to start first by looking at this risk of, what is your risk of VIPIT to begin with? And then if you get VIPIT, what is the risk of anything beyond that? And remember that that risk, because we're talking about very small numbers so far, when you read about these rare cases, that risk is now mitigated by the fact that we are now watching for it. And we have a method to treat it and to manage it. And so that risk is significantly lowered, even just by us being aware of how to manage it going forward.
But please do not think that 1 in 250,000 people who get the AstraZeneca vaccine die of a clot. Not the case. Yeah. Yeah. So it's important to talk about risk. And I know that this could potentially feel a little bit dry, but even my pharmacy students have a really hard time understanding risk because it's just a hard thing for our minds to really comprehend. And so you've seen a lot of things that will actually talk about the percent risk, and the percent risk is, really, really tiny. And it's really hard to kind of understand that. I find the 1 in X number of people way to be a little bit easier, but just to give you a little perspective, first of all, 1 in 250,000, that we kind of picked a central number. We've seen some a little bit lower than that, meaning 1 in fewer than 250,000, but we've also seen a lot of estimates that are more like 1 in a million people for the AstraZeneca vaccine. But to give you some comparison, there's about a 1 in 250,000 chance of an airplane crashing into your house. But that's not something that we tend to spend a lot of time worrying about. At least I don't. Maybe I I shouldn't. So it's really not something that we need to worry about, like airplanes crashing into our house. But it's important to understand that that's a similar kind of risk that we're talking about here. Somebody asked the question of, I read a study which stated that the risk of blood clots from vaccine is lower than that from birth control pills. Have I heard this? Yes, I have. And we have. And the reason, so the next one here is there's a 1 in 300 risk of a clot for pregnant women. And clotting in pregnant women is very common. And that is actually an evolved mechanism to help protect women, because there's a lot of bleeding involved in the delivery process, and that clotting saves lives. That, like, being more likely to clot helps save your blood and keep your blood. But that being said, lots of women who are pregnant will have clots in their legs or in parts of their lungs, and they have to be treated and dealt with. And the question about birth control pills work by mimicking the pregnant state in the patient, in the user of those pills. So there is an increased clotting risk as well with those medications. Obviously something that, in time we need to address, and there are always new birth control pills coming out to try and reduce that clotting risk, and lots of monitoring to try and deal with that. But yes, unfortunately, that's a risk that probably doesn't get talked about enough, is the risk of clotting on birth control medications, and probably not enough is being done there. But there's also a 1 in 100 risk of a clot in postpartum. So right after birth is even higher. It's also really important to remember that there's a 1 in 5 chance of having a clot if you have COVID-19. And there's a 1 in 1,500 risk of dying if you have COVID-19. So the risks for the vaccine are obviously a lot lower. So I know we spent a lot of time on this. It's because reading newspaper articles is a huge source of frustration for us right now, because the way that they're presented, the way that these risks are presented in newspaper articles and television is just sensational for no reason. And obviously it's something that people need to be informed about, but we would probably present the data differently. So the bottom line of all of this is still the really real recommendation is the best vaccine is the first one that you can get. And this is a newspaper article from this morning. That is John Horrigan holding up his immunization card that he got his AstraZeneca. I think his wife is getting it later this week. This actually is a good point to address a couple of questions about vaccination cards. Don't worry if you didn't get a vaccination card. Your vaccine, the dose, the location, the time is all stored in a system that healthcare professionals can access. And you can get a printout of that actually through an app that the BC has, which is the BC Services or BC ID card app, can get you access into a program where you can actually download that if you ever needed it. And there are websites to tell you how to do that, but really you don't at this point. But it is recorded, it is available. A lot of people worry, if I lose the card, do I still get my second dose? Yes, you do. It's not a problem.
Okay, so this is the question. I'm still impressed at how many people are still concerned about the dosing interval. So, and part of that is probably my fatigue with this question, because I've been in the vaccine clinic.
Even though it's a good question.
It's a very good question.
Even though it's a very good question.
I've been in the vaccine clinics now for days and days and days and days. So the second doses for BC for the Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca vaccines are officially 16 weeks from the date of the first dose. Not exactly 4 months, but around roughly 4 months. So it's actually a little bit shy of the 4-month mark. So if you were to be vaccinated tomorrow, you would be looking to get your vaccine probably like August 6th, 7th kind of thing. That would be your second dose. Or if you were vaccinated on Boxing Day, you would be eligible for vaccine tomorrow. So that's kind of the timeline. So, and I understand that all of our clinical trials were done with shorter intervals for the most part, especially for Pfizer and Moderna's vaccines. So there's a few things to put this in context. First, the second dose is meant to be a booster. It's not meant to be your primary source of immunity. It's to boost and prolong your immunity from the first dose. So we do many vaccinations in the adult population, and the booster dose is generally provided at the 2 to 6 month mark. And if you are not feeling well at the 2 month mark, we say, go home, come back, we'll get you your second dose, later. And usually like 6 months, and we would accept in many of those vaccines up to like a year. So,
and the truth is, for all of these guidelines, it's, you know, if somebody comes, so I would imagine, given the age group of people on this call, 1 or 2 of you have probably had the Shingrix vaccine or the shingles vaccine. I have given many, many, many of them. It's supposed to be 0, and then between 2 and 6 months. If you come back at 8 months, you come back a year, doesn't matter. It's fine.
yeah, so there's a good question here about like the 16 weeks is a minimum or a maximum. So the answer is the 16 weeks is a minimum. So that's what BC has now set as its standard as a minimum. The official minimum, as per the company, is like 3 weeks for Pfizer and I think 4 weeks for Moderna. That's the minimum interval. And when you do studies for vaccine, it's important to remember that we test for a minimum dosing interval because you can't shorten that time, because you need enough time to make your first immune response. And then once your immune response is going, then I boost that. I don't wait until the whole thing comes back down, because then I'm just like giving another first dose. So because we have seen such an excellent response with first dose, we have felt more comfortable to extend this dosing interval to the 16-week mark. Now, it doesn't mean that you have no immunity at 16 weeks. It means that your immunity is probably not at the perfect 90 some odd % that we think it would have been at around the 42-day mark or the 6-week mark, where we do have good data up to 6 weeks, which is why we had originally done that original extension. However, again, the vaccine you get your first dose to get your initial immunity, and that itself is very good and very protective. And that's what we've seen. The reason that BC made this decision was we watched the number of positive cases in our nursing home population, in our long-term care homes, and we watched it fall dramatically within 2 weeks of their first doses. And that's why we decided to make this decision. And then the other thing that is a very important factor is our vaccine supply issue. So everybody has acknowledged that the vaccine supply has been not spectacular for Canada. We are still having struggles with our vaccine supply. So we are receiving approximately enough vaccine to do about 3 to 4% of the population every week. This is like saying, like, if I had tons and tons of vaccine around, we would be doing the interval as the US is doing it as per the trial at the 3-week mark, so be it. But because the vaccine supply is very low, the best way to think about this is I have 100 people and I have 100 meals, and my choice is to give 50 of them 2 meals and 50 of them no meals, or for everybody to have 1 meal and everybody go a little bit hungry, but make it until I get my next shipment of 100 meals. So those are my choices. That's the rationale behind this. And when I have people who come into the clinic and they say the dosing interval is too long, but they've come in with their son or their daughter, an elderly person who's come in with their son or daughter to help them, I say to them, I was like, you are delaying your dose so your son and your daughter can have their dose earlier, and I can get them protected too. And so,
and it doesn't cost you much at all.
And it doesn't,
from an immunity
perspective, it doesn't cost you much. Your immunity certainly does not drop to 0. We don't have official numbers. They are coming through the trials from other countries that have done extended dosing schedules. And the extending dosing, again, allows us to immunize more of the population. So if you wanted more information about this in particular, we wanted to talk about where you find good, credible information. And so the best source of information in BC for vaccine-related issues is the Immunize BC website for the frequently asked questions. It is updated daily with the most up-to-date information for BC. So that's the #1 spot. If you needed information about your vaccine or things related to the vaccine, that is the best spot. The second spot that you get information about COVID-19, just around general regulations and things like that, the next best spot is actually an app that BC has created. It's the BC COVID-19 app. It's a free app. It goes nicely on your phone, and it keeps at your fingertips the latest guidance, like where the numbers are, how many vaccines are going out. It's got everything in a nice sort of packaged setup, and it again is updated daily. The third site is the BC CDC. That is a much more text-heavy website, and if you're looking for lots of details, BC CDC's website is basically mined by that app that I mentioned, and the app is actually looking specifically for the most relevant bits. And so now
the question that everybody has, and I hate to say that you're probably not surprised that we can't actually answer it, but when will we sing together? So there's a couple of things that are actually running in our favor. And one of those is the fact that professional choirs in Vancouver have continued to rehearse and record with masks, distancing, and time restrictions over the past few months. In fact, more than a few months. Like, they've been going for most of the time, which is why we've been able to see the great online offerings of groups like Vancouver Chamber Choir, Musica Intima, and those have been fantastic. But because they're doing it, it's a bit of a proof of concept that we should be able to do it too. Community choirs will need to wait for public health guidance on indoor gatherings that allow for a certain number of people. We may also see a little bit of advice for school choirs and bands, which we did see a little bit earlier, and we'll also very likely see advice for sports teams. And so that's something that we need to keep an eye on. And then there's also different, the other thing to keep in mind is that different health regions may have different guidance based on case numbers as well. So Fraser Health versus Vancouver Coastal versus Island versus Northern, they may all have a little bit of different advice. Now, here's the thing. They have to give advice to a lot of people. And there's a long line of people who need advice. And we've got people like BC Choral Fed asking and keeping in touch with them, which is fantastic, to try and find out that, like, just make sure that we're not forgotten. But at the same time, if you ask for specific advice and if you ask for, demand an answer too soon, they'll give the only answer they can give you, which is usually no. So it's really important to understand that we all have to be patient and we have to wait and make sure that we're giving them time. It's also really important to set expectations. As we said, vaccinating is a very key strategy to decrease hospitalization and death. And the US has lifted some restrictions when they've completed vaccination rates at approximately 30 to 40%. The UK is at about 30 to 40% right now as well. And we see that their COVID cases are going down in both of those jurisdictions. You can see here that we're at about 20%. So Bonnie Henry has talked a little bit about the magic number of being around 30 to 40% before we can start to release things a little bit. But that being said, the vaccine does not prevent mild to moderate cases of COVID-19. So our case counts, unfortunately, will likely go up. It just means that hopefully we won't see hospitalizations, we won't see deaths. So that's kind of the end game. So you can see kind of where we are at that link. You can click, and those are numbers from today. But we have to be reasonable with our expectations that, at this rate, we expect to be about September.
So I expect BC to reach the 40-ish% of people with a first dose in their arms if everybody goes and gets their AstraZeneca vaccine instead of like waiting for something else. If we can get everybody moving to get their vaccine, the first one they can possibly get, we're looking at mid to end May to get to this 40% magical number. And that at that point, we start to see cases drop. And with the cases dropping, it becomes possible to lift restrictions. And so the faster we get through the population to get vaccine into arms with the limited supply we have, the higher chance we are of getting to September with 2 doses in most people's arms and making it possible for us to be together again in a room. So let's talk about what Phoenix is doing. So both of us are board members with Phoenix. Both of us have provided both our singer's perspective and our healthcare perspectives to our board. So Phoenix is planning an in-person rehearsal season to start in September. We are looking at larger venues, knowing that if we need to space our audience, that at least we'd have the capacities to space our audience. We are budgeting to make sure we have some sort of video recording, because there will be some people who are still, even if they're totally vaccinated, not comfortable to be in a room at a choir concert. So, and on top of that, we've had a fantastic response to our online concerts. We haven't charged the same ticket price, but we've had certainly, our families in other parts of Canada and other parts of the world have been very, like, it's the first time my family in Samoa has seen my Christmas concert. Like, they would never be able to travel to see it. So, by even having some sort of online component, we have been able to share our music and our love of music with people further away, even though it may not have been exactly in this live setting. So I would encourage every organization to think about the following things. Are you going to require masks and distancing? That may not be your choice. That may be a public health guidance. Are your singers going to be expected to print their own music? So are you going to digitize the music and get it scanned so that it's available for every singer? Are you going to have smaller number of singers with shorter rehearsals? So if indoor gatherings get set at 20, but you require 60, maybe you're rehearsing 20 at a time, and maybe you've cut your choir into small pieces. We did that with Phoenix. Do you have policies around attending rehearsals and sitting at a distance if you're unwell? Maybe that's a policy that needs to be revisited. And the question about, can you, as a not-for-profit organization, mandate that everyone be vaccinated to be a participant in your organization? That is an individual organization choice. If you choose to do so as an organization, that's your choice. And people join the membership knowing what you have decided for your membership. I would encourage you to remember that you have probably never asked if they've been vaccinated for measles, even though we've had measles outbreaks.
Or influenza.
Or influenza. And although we offer to come to your choir and vaccinate all your people for influenza if that's ever an issue. But you know, the idea is to get as much of the population to the point of having some immunity to this. We've all gone through choir seasons where, you know, for those few weeks, all the sopranos have a cold. We've all been through that. And it's not uncommon for us to share germs in a choir. And it's, as long as nobody's severely ill and dying of this disease, which is what the goal of vaccination is, then it makes it possible. We might all still get a cold, but it's not going to be dangerous or life-threatening to anybody. So.
We're very near the end of our slides, and then we're going to take questions. But we did just want to, out of our own curiosity, throw out poll number one more time. If you were offered a COVID-19 vaccine appointment today, would you get it? All right, and it looks like we're very close, so we can end the poll and share the results. And you can see that we've got a lot more in the yes category, and it's still okay to have questions. It's still okay to be undecided, but now we've got a little bit of time to take some questions and kind of see if there's anything else we can do to help with that. Before we forget, and just because it's a nice background, we are going to shamelessly plug our Phoenix choir concert that is next week, that as soon as we're off this call, we will get back to doing video editing for, but you can find out more information at phoenixchoir.com. You know, this is what we're doing to keep our virus particles to ourselves. Thank you for putting the link up. That's great. So there's a few questions here, I think, that quickly just to look at a couple of things for the vaccinating, like, can you require vaccinating? And it says, you know, is that asking, does that invade personal health records? I mean, to some degree, I mean, yes, it would theoretically. That being said, every cruise line is going to do it. It's going to be very common in society, I think. And so I don't think it's unreasonable for an organization that, you know, potentially has a higher risk of transmission to be asking that. I mean, that's just my opinion, though. I can't give you permission for anything.
As an organization, you might have a membership survey as they enter, or a membership thing that they fill out, and you might offer at least, have you had your COVID vaccine? And you might say yes, no, or decline to comment. That's very reasonable. So that you can at least sort of manage some of that. And
Morna, hi Morna, put up a comment that says it seems like smaller organizations will have more flexibility to make their own requirements. That's true. And actually, if you look at the statement of BC Human Rights, something that's publicly available to everyone is a little bit more strictly regulated. Something that is just a private choir where if you want to come, you can come is a bit of a different situation. So yeah.
There was a question about printing your own music. Is that better or safer than providing scores? So, you know, we're happy to continue to support the publishing industry, and, you know, like, really, given the low level of transmission, fomite transmission on surfaces, I don't actually think it's significantly dangerous to distribute scores. I think the challenge becomes sharing scores. So again, if you're in a situation where you would share scores with your neighbor, maybe that is not something that you might sort of want to shy away from, that people have to be able to bring their own music. I think that's reasonable.
So somebody has said, we have many members with severe medical conditions, therefore having been vaccinated, would the mild to moderate symptoms of getting COVID be more severe in these medically compromised people?
Yes. Any cold is going to be worse than somebody with an underlying medical condition, which is why we encourage everybody to do everything possible they can to stay healthy. That includes, eating a good diet and getting exercise and doing things that are good for your mental health and conscious daily breathing. And honestly, singing ticks the boxes for a lot of those things. So we would encourage people to do things that are good for them to keep them in a good frame of mind and healthy at baseline. That's how you're going to manage through any virus that we don't have a special magical treatment for at these times. We've got somebody.
We have Sean has a question, and as an educator, I love live questions. It's so nice. Most of the time, cameras are off and no one wants to talk, so that's great. Go ahead, Sean.
Okay, my name is Sean Peck. I've sung with the Victoria Philharmonic Choir for more than 10 years, and I've been trying to stay on top of this issue for their benefit because I have to confess that I'm a retired public health physician. But there's a couple of issues that I think that are worth mentioning. One is that there's an enormous difference in risk perception from members of the choir. I know that some of our choir, they've got health issues and they're really worried about anything. And of course, the other thing that people worry much about, which I don't think you've commented in a lot of detail, is the aerosol issue. We all know that there was a choir in Washington State, and we know that there's been studies that aerosol, the virus has been spread and caused disease in air conditioning systems, and there's a whole lot of science around that, and it's still somewhat of a debate, but we have to be wary of it because I loved your presentation. I feel very reassured, and I want to thank you very much for it. But it's the risk perception, the aerosol issue, which I think is worth asking you to comment more about. And thirdly, as of this moment, there's a bit of uncertainty about the variants and whether we're going to have newer vaccines updated because of the variants. And it's a lot of scientific uncertainty. And as you rightly point out, our bodies like the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, et cetera, they all eventually come around to give us guidance on these things. So I thought I would comment on that. I think the last point I would comment on is we mustn't forget herd immunity. The people who are being affected most by the virus at this time are the young people. If you look at the data on the BCCDC website, the 20 to 29-year-old group is huge numbers. And that means that lots of young people are getting infected. Some of them will be asymptomatic, but they will be developing antibodies. And therefore the herd immunity is occurring amongst that group, while us older people, we're all being, have got the, the vaccine. And I really like your comments about choirs could require that members could show that they've had the vaccine. If they want to, there's no reason why they shouldn't. Anyhow, just a few comments from a retired public health physician.
Well, I appreciate having some other expertise on the call. Certainly, I think the aerosol issue is one that has been, again, tossed around a lot. And the latest guidance on at least US CDC is still that this is a predominantly droplet spread disease. And yes, you can find it in aerosols. It is still a risk, just like anything is still a risk. And so we sort of balance that risk at a point against the benefits of the activity itself. And so I think we are at a stage in BC where we're not yet at the level of immunity that we would like before we start relaxing restrictions. And I think people have agreed, are quite in agreement with that. So the important thing I think is, now we're going to stop. Yeah. So the important thing to remember is then that we are working our way towards herd immunity, and the proposed herd immunity level for COVID-19 has actually been proposed at 80%. There will be a mix of people who were infected with COVID, as well as you say, the people who have been vaccinated. And I think that is why we're seeing places like the UK and the US, where when they hit first doses at about 40%, plus their background rate of COVID they had in the back, now you're getting kind of closer and closer towards that. So we're not seeing the kind of third wave in the UK and in the US that we're seeing here in BC. And again, again, more encouragement for us to we have to hang on a little bit longer, as Dr. Henry has mentioned many times. We're so close, and we are, as somebody like heavily involved in the vaccine rollout, because the vaccine lives at my hospital in my lab, in my freezer, because I foolishly volunteered my freezer back in December. I watch it come in the door and I watch it leave the freezer as fast as it's coming in the freezer. And so we are really trying to get that vaccine in arms as quickly as possible, and getting people, as many people, to take the first vaccine they possibly can is how we're going to get kind of to that herd immunity. So really great points. Thank you. So we're being mindful of the time. I know that there may still be some questions. So yeah, maybe.
So I mean, we're happy to stick around a little bit longer. That's fine. If anybody wants to stick around on the call, that's fine. But we'll just take the opportunity to thank BCCF for having us and for engaging us in this discussion. It's really nice to be able to share with the community that we love and help make sure that we all get through as healthily and as safely as we can. And again, we're happy to stick around for a little bit. And I think Willi has got his hand up there.
I just wanted to say it's actually kind of the reverse, because it was you who came to us to do this. And so for us to be able to have the two, for us to be able to have the two of you here sharing with the community is really an incredible benefit. I for one, feel so much more reassured. And it's just nice to hear people talk in an up to the minute sort of way, the way that you two do. It's like, as of today, this is what it is. And tomorrow it'll be different, but it's so heartening for those of us who don't have a scientific bone in our body to be able to hear straight from the people who are working in the field. So thank you very much about all the information about vaccines, about Immunize BC, where to get all the info, and specifically about the potential for some sort of in-person stuff. So on behalf of the Choral Federation, once again, thank you both. I also want to thank our BCCF technical team behind the scenes, Andy Rice, Christine Chapeha, and Bridget Colt, without whom we would not be able to do this. So as Carolyn and Vaughn have said, they are willing to hang out for a few more minutes, but of course our time is officially up. So have a great weekend to those of you who need to leave us, and those of you who would like to stay and fish around for a few more minutes, you're also welcome to do so. So thank you once again. It was terrific.
So yeah, thank you again. We're happy to be here. So yeah, it being, public health orders say there's nowhere else we could go right now. So we're happy to answer more questions. So if we go through here, I saw a few comments about the continuing to have a streaming aspect to concerts, and I think that will be the norm as well. And I think it's just so nice also to be able to offer it to people who just, have been part of the audience for how long and now may not be able to come for some other reason, moving or health or something. So that's great. Let's see.
I describe that as the hybrid model, right? Where it's a combination of in-person and online.
So there's a question here that says, will vaccinated people transmit to unvaccinated people if we go back to distanced unmasked rehearsals?
That's a good question. So I think we have to start with the fact that a vaccinated person can still transmit this virus. We have seen evidence of that, and we have seen people who have been vaccinated who still test positive. However, they don't seem to have the same level of morbidity or severe symptoms, which is reassuring. At least if we could turn COVID-19 out of being a deadly virus into being a regular run-of-the-mill, you have a cold kind of virus, that would be amazing. Like, that would be a very good and positive outcome for this.
And I think the case was brought up of the choir in Washington, and we've had some really good discussions with members of the choral community who have done a ton of research about that particular event. It's a very interesting situation because yes, it's something that happened, and yes, there were a bunch of cases, But there have been lots of choir rehearsals since and lots of group gatherings since that didn't result in that large an amount of spread. There's a lot of consideration to whether or not there were other modes of transmission involved. I think that there is some thought that early, the way that we were reporting that type of event, it wasn't as robust as the way that we would document the information now. And unfortunately, that particular case went viral within the news media. And so suddenly the news media went really in heavily on the idea that, something so wonderful as community choir could be this terrible aspect of COVID. So I think it's a very interesting thing and something that, yes, it existed and we have to pay attention to it. But I think that it's probably not as bad as we originally thought. I want to record 10 people spread out in a space for 200 in a church service, preferably unmasked. Would you do it now or wait till later? How about outside? So your last question is the difference there. The current public health orders limit the number of people in an indoor space. And I've actually heard on one of the updates, Bonnie Henry say the limit is 10, but even that is highly discouraged right now. Right now, if you look at our case numbers, they're gone up very, very high right now because of the demand on the healthcare system to both run our healthcare system and provide immunizations to thousands and thousands of people today people per day in hockey arenas and community centers. Our healthcare system is spread very, very thin right now. And we're at the point where some surgeries are having to be postponed simply because either the staff to run those surgeries are not available or the physical space for the daycare after the surgeries where people recover from the surgeries is needed by the emerge department. So we're in situations where, technically by the like by the actual letter of the rules, you could probably have 10 people in a space of 200. Is it the right time to do that? Probably not. Yeah. It's one of those things where, the other thing too is that we've seen the damage that one case did in Washington in limiting choirs being able to get together. We don't want another case like that. We don't want another situation. So it's about approaching things slowly and very, very carefully. And while it sounds like your plan is very, very distanced, it's something that we have to consider very carefully. This is a very good question so are there any people who cannot be vaccinated because of medical conditions? So you talk about this day in and day out. So why don't you go ahead?
No. So anybody can be vaccinated. There is only one contraindication, and that is if you have a known severe allergy or anaphylaxis to one of these small molecule or large molecule within the vaccine. So that's PEG within the AstraZeneca, within the mRNA vaccine, so the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, or if you have a severe anaphylaxis or severe allergy to polysorbate 80, which is in the AstraZeneca vaccine. Everything else, we are happy to have you in the clinic. So you have had you're on some weird drug, you're on some weird, you're on cancer treatment, and you had your chemotherapy today. Doesn't matter, come on in. And we keep saying the same line that some immunity is better than no immunity right now. Like right now, you are walking around essentially naked for this virus. And I don't want you to be naked from this virus. I want you to have some protection from this virus. Even if it's not perfect protection, some protection is better than no protection. And so when I get somebody in the clinic and they're on a fancy biologic for their rheumatologic condition and they've been holed up in their house and very scared, they're super grateful that they're going to get their vaccine today. I say the same thing as like, I'm happy you're here. I have to tell you that you're not going to make the perfect immune response to this, but I'm still glad that you're here because some immunity is better than no immunity. And so that's still the same line. There's no medical condition that we wouldn't offer the vaccine in.
And the line that I tell people all the time when my patients ask me, I'm on this drug that reduces the effect of my immune system. Does that mean I shouldn't get the vaccine? Well, the truth is that the medication could potentially reduce the likelihood or the robustness of the response that you get from the vaccine. The only way to make sure you get less of a response is to not get the vaccine. So it's a very simple thing. Yes, you should. If you're wondering what PEG is, that allergy, I would imagine there's one or two people on the call who have a not so fond memory of drinking a giant jug full of liquid prior to a colonoscopy that they hope they'll never have to do again. That is PEG. So there's a lot of PEG can be found in a lot of things. How would you know if you have that allergy? It's very unlikely. PEG is in a lot of things. How would you know that you don't have that allergy? You don't know you don't, but you do know if you do. So it's not really something that you really need to be too concerned about that. And also, it's in a lot of vaccines. So if you've been getting vaccines throughout your life, then you're fine.
Also, that's why we hold everybody for 15 minutes after their vaccination anyways, because we're monitoring for that allergic reaction, and every clinic is stocked with epinephrine just in case.
Not just epinephrine. We helped set up a clinic, and there are 21 epinephrine kits spread throughout that clinic. Yeah. So you're in good hands when you're there. There's a couple of questions here. What about requiring masks? Is there a valid medical reason to not wear a mask? There's a couple of interesting things. There's a great YouTube video of a physician wearing, I don't know, it's a ridiculous number of masks all on top of each other with his finger on a pulse oximeter, showing that his oxygenation level is just fine. There are some people who really do have very, very intense claustrophobia when they put a mask on, and that's a real challenge. That's a real challenge. But I would imagine that a lot of those people are probably not very comfortable coming to a choir rehearsal either right now. So I mean, it's about dealing with those things with compassion, but at the same time, there aren't any, like severe asthma or anything that says you can't wear a mask.
So if I could ask a question of Carolyn, I've been trying to find out more about the risk of super spreaders. I mean, that was the discussion with that choir in Washington State, and I haven't seen much about that lately. But do we have to worry about super spreaders, that there's going to be somebody will come into your choir who's got a huge viral load in their system? They may not be particularly sick, and it gets spread around. Can you give us any update on that?
Certainly. So from our experience with public health, we have not been seeing the kind of level of super spreader event that we saw at the very beginning. And so the question has come up, are the super spreader events that we saw at the beginning because we started contact tracing late, or is it because they legitimately are super spreaders? And so both questions have been asked. I don't think we have an official answer, honestly, on this. But I think that part of the amazing part of what public health has been doing, like they've drastically increased their numbers to really hunt down the contact tracing. And so while we have numbers at a reasonable, well, the numbers were reasonably low, we were able to do the contact tracing faster than it could spread and faster than we could see that spread. And so I think that there is a factor of, like, especially early on, it was taking us a long time to figure out that this is what was going on. And then by the time you figured it out and went back to contact trace, then all of a sudden, like, everybody seems to have had it. But I don't know about you, but many of my closest friends are in my choir. So I saw them in choir, but I also saw them in other places also outside of choir. And so, how do I know that it happened at that event, or was it because of my other interactions? Because, my choir is like my second family. So, in some ways sometimes there are a lot of mitigating factors. So the answer is we don't have an official answer, but I think the reason we're not seeing so much about it now is because the contact tracing is better.
There's a very good question here about why do we hear so much about the challenging side effects to the second dose as opposed to the first dose. This basically just has to do with the fact that your first dose was effective. And so when your body then sees even just the small amount that results from the second dose of the vaccine, or the spike protein that the vaccine causes to be shown to your immune system, it reacts swift and hard. And that is fine. And so I always tell patients when I give them an immunization at the pharmacy that, I say, you might have a little bit of a fever tomorrow, you might feel a little unwell. That means that your body's picking up what the vaccine's putting down. Like your body is learning from the vaccine. And so it's worth it.
I usually tell them if it's like a wife and a husband that have come, I say to the wife while the husband is standing there, I say, this vaccine means that tomorrow you shouldn't have to, you're going to not feel so great. You shouldn't have to cook. You shouldn't have to do any of those things. Somebody should give you a foot rub. These are all the things that are important to make sure you get a good vaccine response. And usually to the husband who's like laughing. But you know, I sort of blame my grumpiness the second day on like, oh, that's vaccine grumpiness. That's okay. And that's usually a good sign that your vaccine is working.
Very good. I think we're sort of coming to the end of question period here. So yeah, I think we've covered it.
Willi, we're more than happy to answer questions by email if people are would like to do that. I'm happy to throw my email up in the chat. If maybe I'll
Please,
throw
sure, please do. That would be great. I just noticing that we are dwindling and we are you know, an hour and 15 minutes in, so I think we're good. Wow, this is just so encouraging. It really is. It's really encouraging to know that the two of you are there for us as well. So don't be surprised if you get attacked in your email.
no problem.
I should say approached, excuse me.
And again, we'll just say that, you know, we're happy to give general advice. We can't really give very specific patient, you know, one-on-one advice for you. So if anybody has any very specific medical questions, you should give your healthcare practitioner a call.
Yeah, definitely get in contact with your primary care physician. And also keep in mind that for the most part, most vaccine clinics are staffing every vaccine clinic with at least one or two physicians who are very knowledgeable about vaccines. And so if you have a question, even if you show up to your appointment and you're still having questions, it's never a problem to ask and say, I have more questions. I want to speak to the physician or the pharmacist or the nurse in the clinic. I have questions before I'm ready to take this. That's always okay.
Wonderful. All right, everyone. Thank you. Thank you again, Carolyn and Vaughn, and thank you all for your participation and support of the BC Choral Federation. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'm sure we'll see each other again.
Absolutely.
Have a good night.